Welcome and thanks everyone for joining us today. Good evening and good morning to our audience from Asia. My name is Jianan Yang and I'm the postdoc fellow at the Asia Health Policy Program here at the Sharnston Asia Pacific Research Center. Welcome to today's PKU Stanford joint webinar on Asia Health Policies. And today we are delighted to have Professor Erica Field from Duke University as our esteemed speaker. And I would also like to acknowledge our co-host, the Peking University Institute of Global Health and Development. And so without further ado, let me turn the virtual space to my colleague Yuhang Pan from Peking University, who will moderate today's discussion and introduce the speaker to us. So Yuhang, the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks, Jana, and thanks everyone for joining. Please let me briefly introduce our today's speaker, Eric Field, Professor of Economics and Global Health at Duke, with affiliations at NBER, BRAD, and Jameel Poverty Action Lab at MIT. Professor Field specializes in the fields of development economics, health economics, and economic demography. Her work examines the microeconomics of household poverty and health in developing countries. I would say Eric's papers are on several important topics in gender and development in many different parts of the world. So just to mention a few, such as the microfinance, public housing, and social networks in India, major markets in Bangladesh, micronutrient deficiencies in Tanzania, health insurance in Nicaragua, household bargaining over fertility in Zambia, and land property rights in Peru. Her work has been published in several leading journals, including the QJE, JPE, and AER. Eric received her Ph.D. from Princeton in 2003. Before joining the Duke, she was an associate professor of economics at Harvard. In 2010, she was awarded the Eliam Bennett Prize for Research by the American Economic Association, which honors a woman economist under the age of 40 who has made outstanding contributions in any field of economic research. So Eric, if you feel okay, we still have time and you can do presentations for 1 hour, including the Q&A. And during the seminar for our audience, please feel free to ask questions by unmuting yourself, or you can post the questions in the chat box. I also encourage you to turn on your cameras during the seminar to enable us a more interactive atmosphere. So without further ado, let's welcome Professor Field.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for having me. Let me start by saying that I definitely encourage anyone to interrupt verbally if you have a question. I'm definitely used to that style of seminar, and it's most efficient in Zoom. I'm not perfect at keeping track of chat, and so Yuhang, if you could let me know if there's a question in the chat that I missed, that would be really helpful.
Okay, sure.
But please interrupt. All right, well, this is joint work with Nina Buckman, who's a graduate student at Stanford, and Rachel Glenister at the University of Chicago, Xiaoyu Wang, who is at the Free Foundation, and Shahana Nazneen, who is our partner at Save the Children in Bangladesh. And the motivation for our study is pretty straightforward. We're interested in drivers of child marriage, which remains extremely prevalent throughout the world. An enormous number of women are projected to marry under the age of 18 currently, and among women who are alive today, it's very prevalent. And Bangladesh, which is the setting of our study, has one of the highest rates of child marriage in the world, and in particular of underage marriage, which is girls under the age of 15. So an estimated 39% of women who are currently between the ages of 20 and 49 were married under the age of 18. So it's somewhat of an outlier. It's also a very interesting case study because it's a country in which there have been enormous gains for women in other domains. So over the past 2 decades, we see very large increases in girls' schooling because of very active policies to promote female secondary school attendance and attainment. And we also see very large increases in female labor force participation over the past 2 decades, which is a little bit different than neighboring countries where we see high schooling attainment, for instance, in India, in the Middle East, but very low rates of female labor force participation. Fertility has fallen quite steadily over the past several decades. And we also observe over this period changing attitudes towards the tradition of child marriage. There's a number of different sources of survey data that indicate that parents no longer have a strong preference for marrying daughters underage, and not only appear to prefer to wait until the legal age of 18, but also understand the risks associated with underage childbearing. In our survey data, most adults say that not only do they want their son to marry an adult bride or want their daughter to marry as an adult, but they understand that giving birth under the age of 18 is associated with maternal and child health risks. And so what's interesting about these two sets of patterns, the persistence of child marriage and the changes in opportunities for women, is that they're inconsistent with a really simple marriage market preference for youth. So they're inconsistent with a kind of culturally entrenched preference for marrying daughters young, for child marriage. This is just a picture from of data from the demographic and health surveys in Bangladesh over the past 5 waves. And you can see the red line is the trend in child marriage, which is not much of a trend, especially over the past decade. So it's pretty flat and very high. Meanwhile, the other trends are all of the other demographic changes that I just described. So you have a lot of movement and everything that should put downward pressure on child marriage if there's a simple kind of quality-quantity trade-off going on. The other motivation for the study is trying to understand what kind of policies might work to actually discourage families from marrying daughters young. And the existing policy approaches have proven to be fairly ineffective in changing, or very ineffective in changing child marriage. Now, in almost every country in the world, there are age of consent laws that prohibit child marriage. And those we can see quite easily in an event study that have very little effect on underage marriage. Girls' schooling programs do tend to discourage child marriage. That is, if you promote female schooling, give girls scholarships, open up schools, secondary schools for girls, you do see an associated decrease in child marriage, but only among girls who are on the margin of influence for secondary school attendance. That's important here because girls that are the most vulnerable to child marriage are very often not the ones who are on the margin of attending secondary school. And so relying on policies only that promote secondary schooling attainment will miss the most vulnerable girls. Right now, the modal approach to discouraging child marriage throughout the developing world are what are referred to as empowerment programs. So these are training programs for adolescent girls that tend to be a bucket of many different types of information and knowledge and attitude change that are all thought to hopefully discourage girls from entering into marriage very young. And there's some experimental evidence that in 2 countries in Africa, these kind of programs have been effective at least in reducing the rate at which women and girls enter into adolescent childbearing. When we got interested in studying these kind of programs and these sets of policies in South Asia, because our belief was that in settings in which there's arranged marriage, in which adolescents have very little agency over marriage, girls' empowerment programs may have all sorts of benefits for girls, but are unlikely to change age of marriage. And that was our experience from working in Bangladesh. And so in this paper, we consider that kind of very standard empowerment program alongside a novel policy designed to discourage child marriage. And that's a conditional incentive program. And what's novel about it is that the only conditionality is marriage age. So this is essentially a financial transfer to parents who agree to, or as so long as they respect the age of consent, or up until the legal age of marriage. And And what we do is run a randomized controlled trial that randomly allocates these two types of programs to villages within 4 sub-districts of Bangladesh, and essentially runs a horse race between these two policies to determine which is more effective in reducing child marriage and promoting female schooling alongside. And what we find, to give a quick preview, is that the financial incentive was highly effective in reducing underage marriage. Among girls who were eligible for the financial incentive, we see a 19% reduction in underage marriage. And what's really interesting about the patterns of results is that we also observe that there are effects on girls who were not eligible for the incentive in incentive villages. So essentially, there's a positive spillover onto girls who did not directly get financial aid to reduce child marriage of about 10%. We also, another interesting pattern of the with respect to the underage marriage results is that we see that girls delay marriage, a large fraction of girls, because of the incentive, delay marriage, but there's no change in dowry. And so this is interesting because one way of rationalizing a program like this is that people, for whatever reason, have a preference for marrying young. It's a revealed preference. We see them practicing this. There's a dowry system, and so you can capture that preference in the form of the bride price or the dowry. In this case, it's a dowry. And so paying parents to delay could be effective because it compensates for the increase in dowry if there is a strong preference for underage marriage. Then what you would see, though, is offering a financial incentive reduces child marriage, but increases dowry because you're paying them for the higher dowry. What we see is a reduction in underage marriage and no change in dowry or husband quality. There are two margins on which you could change your marriage outcome in response to a financial incentive, and we see neither changing. And so it looks like people just delay marriage to the same person without paying more for that marriage. And meanwhile, we see that empowerment programs, while they did lead girls to adopt more progressive attitudes, so they did empower girls, they had no effect on age of marriage.
Eric, I have one.
Yes, Yuhan.
Yeah, about clarification. So the marriage here refers to sometimes marriage, they get the marriage certificate, right? Well, sometimes they can have de facto marriage, the without a certificate, but they get married. And how to define this kind of term? Yeah, so
that I'll talk a little bit about that. Marriage here is not restricted to legal marriage, but it's all legal. So we're in a setting in which there is no extra legal marriage. There's no cohabitation. It's a dual legal system. So family law is Muslim law, is religious family law, and it's a very religious society. And so you're not going to have any marriages that aren't religiously certified, just because that would be so stigmatized.
Okay,
you said so you can get a marriage certificate. What happens is there's a religious ceremony and there are contracts signed, and so religious law is the law in the system. Then you can go actually get a marriage certificate you can register the marriage. But we're interviewing women about whether they married, whether or not they registered the marriage. And so being married is being legally married, even if it's not registered. So it's a little bit different, I think, than in some settings where you have secular law that governs marriage, you might have a religious ceremony and then it's not a legal marriage. But that here, religious law governs family law. Okay, I'm just wondering. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, there's some ways that they can manipulate and to get your financial incentives in their.
So lying, I think lying is more what could happen. So people, when we interview them, they may be married and they may tell us they're not married, or when they're participating in the program. So that's one of the biggest challenges. I'm going to get to that in just a minute, in how we monitor marriages, because I think that is the biggest challenge in administering this kind of program, is how do you actually verify that people are not married? So I will get to that, because I think that's probably the trickiest part.
Okay, thank you. I also find a comment. Maybe this is from your cursor or in the chat box.
Oh,
They say that the certificate is actually not mandatory in that community.
Yes. I think, sorry if I'm catching it all. A person from Bangladesh.
Like your cursor.
Yeah, the certificate. Yeah, I don't. So a lot of people don't have the certificate, which means that's not an effective way to monitor, unfortunately. I mean, I think, but we're not using that as an outcome, basically.
Okay, thank you. Yeah.
And someone mentioned the same. I think the same person mentioned everyone in our study is Muslim, and so they're governed by. There is a parallel. There's a different legal system governing marriages that are non-Muslim, but our Bangladesh itself has a high Hindu population, but not in the areas we're working in.
Okay. Yeah, please go ahead. Thank you.
Okay, let me see why. Okay, so that set of results led us to think about a different model underlying child marriage in this setting. What could give rise to this kind of a response to a financial incentive that explains the preference for child marriage, but is not related to an underlying preference for youth? So why would people be getting married if they actually don't have this kind of preference for marrying young? And so half of the paper develops a signaling model of the marriage market, which gives rise to a socially inefficient equilibrium in which everyone prefers to delay marriage. So there's no preference for youth. In fact, there's a preference for delay because everyone values female education. There's some return to women being more educated. And in our model, like in reality, when women get married, they drop out of school if they're still below age 18. And that is because they practice a system of patrilocal exogamy, where they move in with their husband's family in a different village. And so in practice, you have to drop out of school. And so in our model, nobody wants women to drop out of school because marriage is preferred, and there's no preference. No one cares about marrying someone who's 17 or 18. And so if there were no other considerations, everyone would wait until a girl was done with school, except for the fact that there are signaling considerations which drive people to marry below the age at which they want to get married. And the way this story works is that, or the way that one can end up in a situation in which signaling considerations are leading to this kind of distortionary behavior, is if there's a bride characteristic that dominates in the marriage market. So the characteristic that's most important to grooms and their families in the marriage market is, first of all, not perfectly observed. Let me center myself again, I can never get this right. And second of all, this same characteristic, if it's negatively correlated with the return, those two features characterize the marriage market, then you can have signaling considerations that lead people to drop out of school early to get married in order to distinguish themselves as preferred bride types. So it's a really stylized model in which the only heterogeneity we have are preferred and non-preferred brides. And we think this is reasonable in terms of applying to Bangladesh and perhaps many other marriage markets, because there's a large anthropological literature on marriage markets in South Asia, which is kind of established that the most important characteristic that families seek in a bride or a daughter-in-law is their kind of social conservatism, or we think of it as women's adherence to traditional gender norms. And this encompasses docility, obedience, religiosity, any kind of adherence to norms that protect the family's reputation. Now, this is something that everyone desires, is kind of the most important thing in a daughter-in-law, but it's not easy to observe. And part of that is because we have pretty anonymous marriage markets in which people don't meet, the bride and groom don't meet very often or for very long periods of time before they get married. And families, we also have a setting in which it's exogamy, so people are not marrying within extended family networks. They're not marrying within the village. They're not marrying, there's not a lot of knowledge between families that are marrying because they're marrying outside of their extended family. And so that's giving rise to this asymmetric information on bride type. We have survey data on asking people what they want in a bride, and the most common answer is something like how traditional she is, her reputation, her nature. So all of that is consistent with this assumption, with what anthropologists say matters. Is this not perfectly observed? You might think, well, in a village, everybody knows who the religious families are. But what makes it interesting, and I think a plausible model of the marriage market, is that first of all, so we collect data on girls' preferences. So we have extensive interviews with adolescent girls in these villages in rural Bangladesh, and we can characterize them by how conservative they are based on their answer to multiple questions about what they think is the correct norm for women and girls. So this includes things like, should girls be able to wear whatever they want? Should they be able to wear makeup even if their parents don't want them to? Should men be served dinner before girls? And so the first thing to note that's interesting is that there's wide variation, even within these 4 sub-districts, in girls' beliefs about the correct gender norms. So essentially, we have girls who are pretty socially progressive. They don't want to adhere to tradition. And then in the same villages, we have quite a few girls who are quite conservative. And what makes this especially relevant to the model that we write down is that girls' level of conservatism differs substantially from both their parents, we also measure parents' norms, as well as their siblings. So even within sibling pairs, we see conservative sisters and progressive sisters and liberal sisters. And so why is this so exciting for me? Because this means that if you're marrying into a family, you really don't know what you're getting, right? It's like, so you might get the girl, because of course, parents who are marrying off their daughters are going to always claim that their daughter is the preferred type. And if there's not much ability to verify that, then there's uncertainty and there's information asymmetry. And so we established that kind of with our data.
Yeah, Eric,
just to give an example.
Sorry for
yeah.
There's one question posting in
Go
chat.
ahead. Oh, in the chat. There it is. It's right in front of me. Now I have to. How do we know the girls are?
Yeah.
Well, that's true. We don't. So there's wide variation in responses across sisters. And it's not accounted for by like birth order. You know, there's some things that you might think it's just a pattern of response of lying, but it's not accounted for by age or, and so it could be random, I suppose. I mean, maybe people randomly lie. We tend to think, you know, there may be biases in terms of how people represent themselves, but we're still looking at the patterns, and that, yeah, we don't know. This is all kind of, you know, descriptives that support our interpretation. I think at the end of the day, I would say, I guess, you know, from having spent time in these villages and interacting with people, I do see a wide difference in how girls interact with us and how they present themselves. It's a changing environment, again, with a lot of labor market opportunities for girls, social media, you know, there's exposure and people are responding very differently. So I suppose part of it is just my observation that people differ in terms of, you know, what they think is correct. But it is a bit speculative when people can lie. It's not incentivized for sure. The survey questions. For some reason, when I click on the chat. Okay, is it so? If you believe that to be true, it's certainly not observable. Is it negatively correlated with marriage market returns to education? I think that, you know, we can't verify that, but it's very likely to be true. Why? Because for one simple reason, that labor market participation is going to vary with how conservative you are. So it's important to establish here that by conservative, we don't fundamentally mean whether or not you're going to work. In fact, what we think of, we've uncovered from interviews with parents is that kind of the ideal daughter-in-law is a doctor who is very religious. You know, so it's this, you know, people value female education and advancement and income, but they still want someone who's adheres to traditional norms. And so But the fact of the matter is, if you, even if everyone wants you to work, if you're more conservative, you're going to be far more restricted in which jobs you can take, because labor market opportunities come with characteristics like distance from the home and hours. And so conservative women are going to be able to work less if they adhere to those norms. And so returns to education are lower. It's kind of mechanical. I think even if we're not thinking about labor market participation, traditional norms dictate that women participate less in household decision making. And so kind of non-economic returns to education, like child rearing or investing in children, will be less influential among conservative women. So I think for both of these reasons, we think this is actually a quite reasonable description of a set of circumstances that could give rise to signaling considerations. Why people might want to, when they're kind of competing on the marriage market, if they're a conservative girl. So this is the intuition of the story, is that that you're more conservative than your sister and your friends. So if you drop out of school, and that the market is going to infer that if you drop out of school early, that you're someone who is more likely to be conservative, because you would only be willing to drop out of school if you had relatively low returns to education. And so what that leads to is an equilibrium, potentially, in which first you could have a separating equilibrium, where the religious girls drop out early, they pay less dowry, and they potentially marry a different type. But you could also have a pooling equilibrium, where if the dowry differential is big enough, if people really want that religious girl, then it might be worth your while, if you're not that religious, to hide your type by dropping out early also. And so that's that's a situation in which you'd get everybody dropping out early, because no one wants to reveal that they're a progressive girl in this market. It's too costly. The parents don't want that. But if you give people, if you offer the village a financial incentive, that essentially lowers the signal to noise ratio. So it's no longer, there's less potential to signal, because there's this other reason why you might stay in school other than being a non-preferred type. And so that could shift everybody from a low education to a high education equilibrium. And that's the intuition of the model. Okay, what's interesting about this particular equilibrium, this model of child marriage, is that first of all, it implies that you could have child marriage rates that are, again, socially inefficient. And so what's interesting about that is that to change it, you just have to help people re-coordinate on a different equilibrium. You don't have to pay people to do something they don't want to do. You just have to make it, less, you have to somehow, offering a financial incentive, again, means that there's less you can infer about someone's behavior if they drop out, if you offer it to everyone independent of their type. Which also means that reducing child marriage could be Pareto improving. And so it's a little bit less, it's less controversial to go in and pay people to do something they don't want to do. You can get a lot of pushback. It's also more likely to be politically feasible. If it's more likely to be something that, the public supports and is in favor of, than something, again, that's pushing them away from a kind of cultural preference. What's also interesting is that it means that it could be very cost effective, because if you're just trying to reorganize people around an equilibrium that actually makes everyone better off, in theory, you don't need a very large financial incentive to do that. So you're not just compensating people for the stigma of marrying late, you could, first of all, it could be a very small amount. It just has to push enough of the low types towards later marriage. And also, you could capitalize on spillovers, because again, if even people who don't receive the incentive should be willing to delay their marriage because they get the return to education. And so it means that it's the compensation you have to offer people is cheaper, because you just need a little bit, and then they also get the returns. And then you also, as long as people can, as long as it's not perfectly observed who gets the incentive, people could free ride on the opportunity even without receiving the incentive. So that could make it very, very, a very cheap policy. All right. What's the last bullet point here is, what's also important about our model is that it has implications for empowerment programs. It has implications for again, the standard approach to reducing child marriage is to empower women. Now, if you reframe that in the context of our model, that means empowering girls is trying to change their types. So in our model, we have conservative girls and progressive girls. No one knows who's who. And so the extent to which the signaling is valuable depends on the distribution, the distribution of types in the village. The more progressive girls there are in the village, the more valuable the signal that you're conservative, right? So the more, if they're only 10% of girls are really religious, they're definitely going to drop out, right? To say, hey, look at me, I'm the one you want. So that means if you implement a policy where you change the distribution of types, you actually succeed in making girls more progressive. What that does, in addition to being socially good, it's good, I think, that's subjective, but to make girls, more in favor of progressive gender norms, but it does also have this effect of changing people's perception of the distribution of types. In other words, now prospective grooms and their families are more concerned about marrying a girl from this village that's had an empowerment program because she's more likely to be empowered. And so this value of dropping out early goes up. And so this is a way in which an empowerment program could have a perverse effect on marriage rates. It could increase people's incentive to signal that they're a traditional girl, if everybody knows the empowerment program exists, which they tend to. Okay, so
question in the chat.
Yeah, you.
Yeah, thank you.
Oh, there's another question. Is it your question? Oh no, in the chat.
Yeah, chat box.
Let's see. Wait, I need to. Let's see if I can do this. Okay, good. So, okay, that's important. The incentive did not work differently at different income groups. And so that's another test of whether or not it's just a financial compensation, because the value of the financial incentive should be very different for low income versus high income. The financial incentive we offered was the same for everybody, but you could think, the value of that amount of money is bigger for lower income. And so that's another piece of evidence we have against the just compensation model. Okay, let me say a bit about the marriage market in Bangladesh. So it's arranged marriage. This is really important because boys and girls don't have much agency when they get married. Most marriages are actually arranged by a third-party matchmaker, and that's because you're trying to match from someone from another village outside of your extended family. So it's a very anonymous marriage market. Girls move into their husband's village when they get married. And almost all marriages have a pre-negotiated dowry. I suspect it's even higher than 85%. There's a little bit of underreporting dowry in the data, but it's by far the majority. And it's high. It's a couple years of wage income high. There's also a negotiated prenuptial agreement in Bangladesh, which is an amount of the marriage contract that you pre-specify. But I'm not going to talk too much about that. And the average rate of child marriage in our study villages is 41%. So again, what we're trying to establish in the theory part is that our patterns can only be explained by signaling and reputation concerns, and that is to distinguish it from origins of child marriage that are explained by strong cultural preferences for youth, wherever that comes from. You think that girls should marry early to protect their safety, to increase fertility. There are a lot of theories that people have. And then there's a second class of explanations for why people do things. It's more similar to the signaling story, in that why do people end up in a bad equilibrium in terms of doing something earlier than they want? There's a category of explanations related to kind of unraveling models. And I'll talk a little bit about why I think that that can't explain what's going on in our village, but that will come up in the results. I'm not gonna, I have a short amount of time, so let me just say what we did. So we cross-randomized these two programs, empowerment and incentive, financial incentive, and then meaning that there are also some villages that get both and some control villages. The incentive was offered every 4 months or 3 times a year. It was not a huge amount. It was approximately $16 in value at the time, and it was offered in kind. There's no reason for that except that it was easier to distribute than cash when we designed the program. Nowadays, you could easily deliver a financial incentive through bank transfer. How did we monitor marriage? That's by far the hardest part of this kind of policy. But it's not as hard as it sounds. So what's useful here is that girls move out of their house when they get married. And so what we did was rely on spot checks, 3 spot checks, finding the girl at home at her parents' house, and telling us she wasn't married was considered sufficient. So unannounced visits was considered sufficient to conclude that she was married. We also asked neighbors, we asked community health workers, we collected data from registrars of registered marriages, but none of those added much in terms of we didn't catch many marriages that way. We did catch some marriages not being able to find the girl at home. Like her parents said, oh yeah, she's not married, and then we could never find her at home. And so I think that actually works in this system. And also, so just to get back to Yuhan's original question, you could have girls marrying and then staying with their parents, but we decided that's as good as being unmarried. The important thing is staying with your parents and staying in the village where you can go to school. And so that's the only room for kind of lying in this system. We also collect data for 10 years on marriage, and there's no change in people's reports, which to me suggests they're not lying. So long after the incentive is over, they're still telling us they married at the same time. And so I think this works. This is what happened 3 times a year, is that girls had to bring their registration card to the village and were given cooking oil. The empowerment program, we took exactly from Save the Children, and Brock has an empowerment program that's been delivered in many parts of the world. And we took the exact curriculum, which bundled reproductive health knowledge, negotiating skills, homework sessions, all sorts of information. It was very intensive. This was a very popular program, and the participation was high. It was on average more than 1.5 hours a day after school. And it really actually seemed to deliver quite a lot of good stuff for these girls. Again, our point is not that these programs are bad, just that they're not effective in child marriage and can backfire a bit. We collected data from the beginning of the program in 2007 for 10 years until 2017. And program take-up was high, just take my word for it. I'm going to show you really simple experimental estimates, which are facilitated by the fact that program take-up was very high. And what you see here is, first I'm going to show you the effect on empowerment villages in the first row. The second row is the effect of participating in the incentive. And the third row is the coefficient estimate on the interaction term. So if there's any additional benefit to any complementarity between the two programs. The results across all different marriage outcomes, which includes underage marriage, child marriage under 16, whether or not you're still married right after the program ended, that's midline. And then whether you're by the time in 2017, if you're still unmarried, that's the only one that we hope converges, is that, by the time 10 years later, we want everyone to be married at the same rate across incentive programs, across the different treatments, because that allows us to look at marriage age, which is in columns 8 and 9. And what we see is essentially in row 1, there's no effect of the empowerment program on marriage. In fact, the coefficient estimates are, positive on whether you're married at midline, for instance, or married under 16. Married under 18, it's negative, but very close to 0. In contrast, the second row, incentive, has a large and consistent and robust impact on underage marriage. As I said before, the column 2 estimate of negative 0.074 corresponds to a 19% reduction in the rate of underage marriage. So that's a big effect of a small amount of money. And there's a corresponding change in births, which is under 20, which is pretty mechanical. This is the overlapping distributions of just control villages where nothing happened and any incentive village. And what's interesting here is that it's just a rightward shift of the marriage age distribution, not necessarily what you would expect, because the program ended abruptly at age 18. And so you would normally expect it to be a tighter distribution right around 18. Once the program ends, everyone rushes to get married who delayed. It looks like there's some kind of search frictions is our interpretation of this, that actually postpone marriage beyond the life of the program. So there's another kind of efficiency gain of this kind of policy, is if you push people to delay a year, you actually get more than a year of delay. There's an increase on schooling, which always happens when you delay marriage. So I won't go into that. It would be surprising if that didn't happen. And here's the results I referenced before. What we see in terms of dowry is not what you would expect if you're compensating people for doing something they don't feel comfortable with. If you look at row 2, there's a big reduction in underage marriage and no change in dowry. In columns 3 to 5, these are what we observe from parents about husbands. Parents are not significantly less educated. They're not significantly more likely to have salary jobs, or less likely, or to live, more likely to be from the village, for instance. And so it really, and meanwhile, the empowerment program, look in column 1, row 1, what you see is an increase in dowry. So this is, again, dowry from woman's family to the man's, suggests that there is a penalty to being in a village with an empowerment program. This is, again, and no change in marriage age. So this is, again, consistent with you're more likely to be empowered, and empowered is actually not what the marriage market values. And so you pay more dowry if you come from that village, because you're competing with girls from other villages. I'm not going to go into the model because we have a short presentation. So let me just tell you the key way we pin down our story is with the spillover effects. And so, So what we test for, that the model predicts, is that we should see untreated low types also delaying marriage. So untreated girls who don't receive the incentive, if they can credibly claim to be getting the incentive. So policy-wise, for instance, if you had a lottery and said you're eligible for the incentive, you're not, but the market didn't know who won the lottery, then what you would expect to see is that girls who are low types, meaning progressive girls, who can credibly claim to be getting the incentive, should also delay marriage even without being paid. So we test for that. We did not design our experiment around testing this because we thought about it later. But we test for it in a way that I think works well in our setting. And so geographically, what we have, even though it's rural Bangladesh, it's a very uniform population density. So there are not clear boundaries between villages in our setting. And our different programs are saturating the villages. So what we have is a lot of girls who live in control villages, but they live really close to the border of program villages, of incentive villages. We know that it's not actually, and so there's a lot of ambiguity about which village a family belongs to. We know this because the first thing we had to do in designing this study was to map all the people to villages, to do a census, to ask the village leader which households belong in your village. And there was a ton of ambiguity. So even, the village leader would say, that household is not in our village. And then we'd go tell the household, you're part of this program. And they'd say, we're in the other village. So we make use of that by identifying girls who live within 500 meters of the boundary of an incentive village, but don't receive the incentive themselves. And we are the ones who kind of, told people if they were eligible or not. So we know for a fact that these girls are not actually eligible. They're not receiving any money. What's unique about them, though, is that the market would expect them to receive the money. And so what we see in here, we look at those girls and we see whether or not they actually appear to change their marriage age. And this is evident in column 1. So we see a significant decline, a 10% decline in the rate of underage marriage among girls who are eligible age for the program, but not living actually in the program village, but only if they're within 500 meters. If you shift that, if you look at girls 500 to 800 meters, actually that goes away very quickly, spatially speaking. And so we think that's consistent with, because at that point, the market can infer that you're not receiving the incentive, so you can't pretend. Column 2 is showing that is no effect on girls who are younger, who are living close to the incentive boundary, but are too young to be in the program. Again, the market should not think that you're receiving the incentive because the program ended by the time you were on the market. When we look at the in-depth survey of girls, we can actually test the more nuanced prediction, which is all of this free riding should happen among the low types, the progressive girls. We didn't ask parents to characterize their daughters, so we interviewed a subset of girls. And what you see in column 3 is this huge effect among the low conservative, among the progressive girls, a huge reduction in underage marriage. Meanwhile, the conservative girls, there's no significant change in behavior. They're not getting an incentive. There's no reason they should change their behavior. And so this again is, we think, pinning down this signaling story that we have and distinguishing it from just paying people to delay marriage when they'd rather marry early, or an unraveling story also wouldn't have this kind of prediction. All right, so I don't actually have a clock in front of me. It's behind, I guess it's behind this screen, but I know I must be close to time and I'd love to take some questions. And so I'm gonna get straight to the conclusion. I think what we've established with the study is that the signaling environment is contributing to the patterns of underage marriage that we observe in Bangladesh. It also implies, I think, that standard empowerment programs are likely to be less effective and may even backfire, may even increase the rate of underage marriage. And I didn't present it here, but we do see that in the subsample, that there are significant increases in underage marriage in empowerment villages. But what's exciting about it is that it means we think there's a strong potential for a relatively small financial incentive to have a large effect on child marriage. And a big effect on increasing female schooling. All right, that wraps up what I wanted to share with you. But again, please speak up if you have any questions about what I kind of rushed through.
Yes, thank you so much for doing it actually on time. And yeah, any questions?
Can I ask one question?
Absolutely.
Hi, Erika, Mugdha here from Stanford. Thank you for your presentation. Good to see you. So just one clarification which would benefit all of us. So when you say that like the financial incentive doesn't have to be large, even a small incentive could actually move this low type people. I wonder how is that happening? And overall, do you think it's itself the cooking oil? Because $16, again, it's a very low percentage of the household income in the year. Or maybe the story actually, this financial incentive giving some kind of motivation to this woman for some kind of independence. I don't know why empowerment is not doing that, but some kind of financial independence, though it's very small. That's why maybe, even the spillovers, the girls who were close to the incentive villages, they also start believing that, oh, I have some kind of, independence financially, maybe, so I can signal that to the marriage market.
Yeah, so I guess the best evidence, well, let me start with the first question. I think it's kind of impossible to know, but essentially the amount that you have to, the size of the incentive that's going to be effective in the signaling world is going to be the part that would push over a small, like a threshold number of people in the village. And so you can, it's everyone, yeah. What's going to push people over is going to depend on how much society values the conservative girl versus her education. So everybody wants an educated girl, but they also want a conservative girl. The difference in the strength of those two preferences is going to be how much, you have to pay people to deviate. And so, because that's going to determine the dowry difference in getting a less educated but conservative girl versus a more educated but not conservative, and that's probably changing over time. It probably varies across space. And in theory, like, how much you'd have to pay an individual family is also going to depend on the dowry, the other characteristics that determine her marriage outcome. And so if there are enough girls that have where a small amount of dowry difference is going to push them over, then everyone else is going to shift to the preferred equilibrium. And so it's kind of impossible to characterize villages ex ante by whether or not this is going to be that kind of village, or to know if it's possible. But it does mean that, you know, it's possible in a way that just compensating people for preferences is not. I guess I think that's the, you know, if a lot of people marry young because they believe it's really valuable for girls, or you know, then you're going to have to pay a lot of money to get people to change that behavior. If people are doing something because they're scared of revealing their type, if you can get enough people, but it could be a small fraction of the people who are marrying young that actually need to be pushed, that's going to distort the signal. And so it could cost much less. It won't necessarily. And again, you might actually have a setting in which you already have a separating equilibrium, in which case there's nothing you can do. But yeah, there could, you know, we're saying there could be, and, you know, we randomly found villages in which there seemed to be high rates of child marriage despite many opportunities for girls. There also seemed to be, you know, introducing a small signal, and we took a stab in the dark at the amount of financial incentive. The way to roll out a larger policy would be to, you know, obviously vary the size of the incentive and see what it takes. We could have easily offered too little and not gotten enough people to move, and that, you know, so it wouldn't change the information value. So in that sense, we got lucky, but it demonstrates what's in theory feasible, potentially anywhere. Financial empowerment, I think the strongest evidence, I mean, my feeling is that the cooking oil, these are pretty tight, unmarried adolescent girls don't have a lot of freedom of movement and financial independence. So I think even giving a small stipend is unlikely to change their ability to earn income or live on their own. The empowerment curriculum is more likely to do that because it tells people their legal rights, you know, but the financial, so my intuition is that there's not much potential. It's also inconsistent with the heterogeneity. So we cut the data. We looked at a lot of patterns, who responds more to the incentive, and just don't see a lot of patterns by things like wealth. And so that to me would suggest, like, I think if you get this kind of financial empowerment or like parents' preferences, so things that would constrain the girl, you know, you don't see the patterns you would expect to see if it was driven by the value of the cooking, the wealth effect of the cooking oil. That's, I think, the best response. And the spillover. I mean, you said you thought maybe there would be an financial independence spillover, but that's also a little hard to explain unless girls are kind of making transfers to each. I guess it's more a norm. I think this happens so quickly. I guess I think there's not much room for the spillovers to be accounted for by just a change in social norm is, I think, our best reason to not think that's part of what's happening.
Right. I see someone's raised their hand. And do you want to unmute yourself?
Yeah, hi. I'm packing to go away for a weekend with my son who just finished his sophomore year at high school. So I'm not going to put my camera on. There's nothing here that you want to see. But thank you so much. I'm Lalita Duperon. I'm also at Stanford. Hi, Mukto. So I don't know if you touched upon this, and I apologize if I missed it, or maybe it's just completely outside the realm of what you're trying to do. But you said at one point, when you do these spot checks, you might find girls still living at home, even though they're married. And so you count them as being unmarried, because that's essentially what you're looking for, is for people to stay at home, for women to stay at home and in school. And I was thinking, isn't that though the ideal scenario? Is there any data that can be incentivized towards, with this idea of having educated yet conservative? So girls do marry early, and so that is in place, and the danger of them not being married and not being, whatever the fear is controlled by that patriarchal system, but yet they stay in school until they're 18 or 21 or whatever. Could that be the best of both worlds scenario? And is there any way you could look at that?
We do. So there is a bit of an institution of that in terms of, but it's a matter of months. So what you'll see sometimes, I think in our data, it's like 5% of marriages you see girls not immediately moving in with their husband. And so this tends to be a small amount of time to finish the school year. So sometimes girls will get married early, will get married in May. That's not actually the calendar. I can't remember what it is, but if it were our calendar, get married in May and then join their husband's family in June. I don't know how they negotiate for that, but it's a really good idea. I don't, to do that for a year, I'm trying to think what the risk.
I know it happens in India, or it used to happen in India, but I don't know anything about customs in Bangladesh. So
so you never see that for more than, I wonder what the range is, but in my mind, it's not ever more than 4 months that people report doing that, like older, but that doesn't mean. So I don't know. Yeah, I'd have to think about that, because that is in some ways the best of both worlds. And
right. Considering what we're working, I mean, I can think of mumuch better worlds, but that's not what we're working within. So, okay.
There are other fears, I guess, people have of like, yeah, I'm completely speculating, but I'm sure there's some interest in kind of controlling married women's, interaction with other men or but that's an interesting idea.
Thank you, Erica.
Thanks, Loeb.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. And there's one question posted in the chat box. Yeah.
Oh.
You may take a look.
So the second one, we weren't sure it would work if something like security concerns were really driving people's, that's a preference for youth. Like, you think girls are safer with their in-laws. I think that, what our results demonstrate is that, in fact, parents can monitor their daughter's safety just as well as in-laws can. And there are a lot of, as I said before, there are very strong mobility restrictions on adolescent girls. And so that would be a reason it wouldn't work, but it did. And so I think, it appears that, this is a setting in which a lot of girls actually work in garment factories and work outside the home in tightly controlled environments. And so it's like you say, would send a girl to live in a garment factory in which part of the contract with parents is that they're tightly monitored. It's like summer camp. It's like, you can't, they're treated like children, and it's because the girl's reputation and safety is so important to parents. So I think it's just that there are enough institutions that prevent girls from facing that kind of risk in terms of restricting their movement. But it would be a reason that you wouldn't see this if that were enough of a problem. And now I forgot the first question. Should go back. Yeah, no. That's not gonna do it. Sorry, I'm terrible at Zoom. I'm happy to answer the first question, but you have to remind me what it is.
So any further questions from our audience?
Yes. Hi, Professor Field. So actually, I think I need to ask not a very intelligent question. So actually, I want to know, is the marriage a household decision or individual decision, or a mix? Because it seems like, I don't know, according to your presentation, then it should be more like a household decision. Is it?
It's parents' decision. So in some cases, girls have veto power. They'll ask, they can express a preference. What I don't know much about is boys, but my sense is that it's really parent to parent. Boys are pretty young too. Most marriages are, the age gap is kind of consistent. It's like an average of 4 years, like you see everywhere, but the girls are young and so boys are pretty young. So it's definitely a household, and we model it as parents' decision over their kids' future. There are love marriages, but they're very rare. Love marriage would be kind of the individual bride and groom choose someone or choose each other.